Well, good morning. Joining us is State Senator Jerry Hill from the Peninsula. If you're watching this show, chances are you're watching it using electricity. That electricity is coming to you from Pacific Gas and Electricity, a company that is now on the verge of bankruptcy and faces some rather serious problems going forward about how to handle wildfires. This has been in your bailiwick, and PG&E is declaring bankruptcy.
Yes.
I don't think anybody's going to be able to stop them. People will be crying about it and saying that it's not necessarily fair, but they were faced with billions and billions of dollars.
Yes.
It's a huge corporation, but it's also a huge utility that serves everybody watching.
Right.
What are we going to do about it, and how do we keep ratepayers from getting the short end of the stick?
Well, and that's the problem, because when they went bankrupt the last time and got out of it in 2004, the ratepayers were stuck with all of the debt. The shareholders were left clean, the creditors, everybody got their money. But
well, we've already agreed to be on the hook for the wildfire damage of the, what was it,
the
year
fires
before?
of 2017.
Exactly.
Yes. Well, part of the hook, yes. There was a bailout for that, but there's nothing going forward. And as we know, the fires of 2018 were the largest in California history. And so what we want to do, and I authored legislation and introduced it on Friday, that will allow the legislature to look at the end of the bankruptcy proceedings, when restructuring is done, the PUC has to agree to it. I want to make sure the legislature is looking after the ratepayers, and that way we can approve that one way or the other.
Well, the legislature approving deals like the one that essentially helped get them out of the...
You're right.
Doesn't necessarily mean that the ratepayers aren't going to get it.
I agree, but this is a new day. The legislature, I think, has a new... They've opened their eyes a little more to what PG&E has done.
But PG&E is a company, but it's also thousands of workers. It serves so many communities. It's just got balancing act.
Well, it is a balancing act, but we want it to be balanced fairly and balance it in a way that not, that the burden isn't all placed on the ratepayers, because the ratepayers don't have a voice. Everyone else, we're talking about labor, they have a strong voice. The creditors have a voice. The shareholders have a voice. The ratepayers are the ones that really don't have a way to protect their interests going forward, and that's what we want to do.
Now, Governor Gavin Newsom has said that he wants the victims to make sure that of the fires, yes, that PG&E is legally responsible for, to be at the front of the line when any money comes from.
I hope they are.
Okay. I haven't heard much from the governor's office about you, me, and the other ratepayers.
Well, he'd indicated, and I hope that my legislation will support and complement what he wants to do, because this way he may want to have some type of reorganization and structure that protects the victims, protects the ratepayers, and that's what he indicated that before. But at the end, it's up to the PUC. So I want to make sure we do have that voice.
The PUC is us.
Well, the PUC is us, but they are an appointed commission, and they have independence without legislation that can direct them what to do, to tell them what to do.
Is there any sign that the governor is going to change the Public Utilities Commission, which is supposedly our watchdog on this?
Well, I think in the long run, yes. It's not something that can be done overnight, but I think he wants to reform that and make it a more nimble, it's so bureaucratic, so cumbersome. It takes them years to make decisions. It's not the commissioner's fault. It's the structure of it. It's the way it's designed and the way it operates. It can't move as quickly as it has to move.
Well, and that's part of the big reason why we're in the situation we're in now?
That's absolutely true.
So we have ourselves to blame?
Well, we have ourselves. We certainly, everything is ourselves. I mean, we're the legislature of California. It's the people, but we do have ourselves to blame, because it was created through a constitutional amendment, and the PUC is just not capable of dealing with the nuances of today's electricity. They deal with water, they deal with gas, they deal with everything, and the government can't do it. That's why we rely so much on the utilities to do their own self-reporting.
So yeah, and that's why we have discussions now about the government taking over the utilities, like they're going to do a better job?
They have in some of those cases where they have taken over and they operate those utilities. Sacramento, Los Angeles, Palo Alto, all public utilities, cheaper rates, safer system.
Child abuse. It's one of the most disturbing topics that we have in the country and in the world. Joining us this morning is State Senator Jerry Hill. This is a topic brought to light from everything from your local schools to your church.
Correct.
Who's involved and who reports it. How are our laws set up now, and what do you think it is we need to do to get better reporting?
Well, you said it. It is the most serious crime ever in this country, and we've established that as a priority, because right now there are 46 categories of professionals who interact with children who are mandatory reporters. Those are doctors, those are physicians, psychiatrists, therapists, school athletic directors, teachers. All of those have to report when they see or hear of any child abuse or neglect. It has to be reported to the authorities for correction. And it has worked, and because it is a priority, those, they've eliminated any of the freedoms that you may have in terms of some of the professions, like, like the doctor, the psychiatrist, or the therapist.
Are there any exceptions?
Well, there is an exception, and the exception is in 1997, they added the clergy to that mandatory reporting list, but they made one exemption, and that exemption is in that penitential communication, that communication where you're having a privileged conversation with your clergyman.
Like a confessional?
Confessional is one example, or counseling in their office has been interpreted as a privileged communication. That is exempt, and unfortunately there have been 14 attorneys generals, the United States government, many countries have noticed that because of that exemption, we're seeing thousands of cases of abuse.
Now, when we have that, let's be clear. If you're talking to your therapist, is that an exempt conversation, or no, they have to report it?
They have to report.
If you're talking in a school or something like that, that has to be reported.
If a teacher hears
if it's a doctor,
yes.
So you have doctor privilege as well. What about a lawyer? If a lawyer hears about something like this, if a client says something, I'm involved, does the lawyer have to report it?
Well, the attorney-client privilege is sacred and specifically called out in the Sixth Amendment of our Constitution. So that's privileged, and that will remain privileged. There are no exceptions to that. That one will stay because it's in our Constitution.
Now, the church exemption, was that, it's legal, it's legalized. Was that based on anything constitutional, or was that something that is cultural that we've decided?
Well, it's cultural.
Whether it's a priest or a rabbi or something like that, does it cover all religions?
It covers all religions.
Okay.
Any clergy communication, or if someone within the church.
Well, how does that jive with the separation of church and state?
Well, I mean, you'd say freedom of religion or freedom of speech. None of our rights are absolute. The freedom of speech, as we all know, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. That's because you're putting others at harm. In religion, it's the same. It's not absolute. Your beliefs are absolute. Okay. You can believe anything you want. But when you practice that religion and it puts others in harm, that's the problem.
Now, you want to end that exemption.
I do want to end that exemption.
Now, some might say, if we start with this, what's the next one? Or what's the next one where you can't have privileged conversations?
Well, this is only related, and this privilege and the exemptions and the calling out are only with professionals in child abuse and neglect, only specifically to child abuse. Not if you went to a therapist and were talking about a murder that you committed or another crime. It's only related to child because it's such a serious offense. Okay, now people's gut reaction would say, okay, I'll go with that possibly, but do you think there's going to be resistance to this, culturally, religiously? Because you are going into something that dates back thousands of years. The confessional, whoever is in there, has always been sort of like sanctuary, has always been held. Well, 10 other states have already done this and eliminated the exemption for clergy communication. So it has been done before in the United States, one. Two, we feel that there will be resistance, certainly, for any change, but when you look at what we're trying to do, which is protecting children. If we are looking at these privileged conversations, I wonder if that would you envision this extending to reports as well? In other words, if a church has done an investigation into its ministers or priests or whatever, and has come up with reports that date back, would those continue to be confidential, or would the state have the power to come in and say, we want those as well, those are no longer privileged? Well, I don't know if it goes to that extent in terms of the privilege or elimination of it, but I do know that if there is evidence of a communication that does indicate child abuse or neglect, that would be mandated to be reported. And that's where I think we see the difference there, is in the fact that this is the only exemption. It's going to be interesting because you and I know that laws like this, when they're up for change, people say one thing publicly, but they might not necessarily want to vote on it one way or the other. So this sounds like one of those bills that's either going to make it through or get quietly sidelined in the halls or in the committee. It may get sidelined in the halls, but I don't know if it'll go quietly.
Oh, that's gonna be interesting. All right, then we're probably gonna be taking this one up again. All right, thank you for joining us this morning.
My pleasure.
It is a very serious topic.
It is.
It's going to be one that's going to play into Sacramento very big this year, I think. State Senator Jerry Hill.